Welcome back, good souls. Welcome back. So, now we are talking about an era of American history known for nationalism and sectionalism. Now, the way that this new century for America starts, it starts out very politically divided. We are starting to get into the era of political parties. We saw that in the election of 1796 and how the political parties are separating the country out. And we're going to begin the new century in much of the same fashion. But once we get further into the 1800s, America is going to fight a war, the War of 1812. Some people call it the Second War for American Independence because it is against the British. And American independence is threatened during this time period. But America is going to pull through in the War of 1812, and it's going to usher in a new era of nationalism in this country. In fact, it becomes known as the era of good feelings because everybody feels great to be an American and everybody is working great to be a good American and to get along with the country and with their countrymen and do things that push the country forward. So we see nationalism in all segments of life during this time period, right after the War of 1812. And nationalism at this point in American history means, of course, having pride in being American in the United States. But it also has this extra caveat to it that you would do something if it was detrimental to you as long as it was beneficial to the country. That's the kind of attitude that people took during this time period, is that it was a very selfless nationalism, that even though it may be bad for me, if it's good for the country, I will do it, right? And so everybody is feeling good, right, in this era of good feelings. And you see nationalism everywhere. You see nationalism in politics, in the judiciary, in economics, in society, everywhere. Everybody's feeling great. But, of course, all good things must come to an end, right? And fractures start to show up in this era of good feeling. And we call those fractures sectionalism, where issues start to get divided between Americans, between the North, between the South, between the West. And how are they going to deal with those things? And sectionalism is going to last a lot longer than nationalism. And nationalism and sectionalism really kind of ebbs and flows for the next few decades until we get to the Civil War. But sectionalism is definitely going to overtake nationalism by the time all is said and done. So let's see how this era starts. Now, this era starts with the election of 1800. And this election is certainly one of the most important in American history. It is an all-out contest between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And there were definitely a lot of issues that the two parties disagreed on. We'll talk about 5 of them, right? The first is who should rule the country. The Federalists believe that the educated should rule the country. And of course, the educated at this point are typically going to be your more wealthy class of people, right? But they believe that the educated should run the country because they've read philosophy, they've read history, they've read religion, they've read government, right? So they should be the ones to further the country, right? Whereas the Democratic Republicans believe that it's the people, that the average farmer should be the one that is running the country because they have the most at stake, right? It should be for the average man, and the average man should be the one who determines the course of the country. Another issue is the difference between a strong federal government and a strong state government. Federalists are for a stronger national government, whereas the Democratic Republicans are for stronger state governments. Then we looked at the economy. Federalists are more pushing towards manufacturing, whereas Democratic Republicans are pushing more towards an agricultural, farming society, right? So we have 2 different pulls here in the economy, one trying to progress towards a more industrial manufacturing, and the other saying we should stick with what we know are cash crops and our subsistence farming. Then we also have the issue of constitutional interpretation. Now, the Federalists are more loose with their interpretation of the Constitution. They see it's known as loose construction, or it's also known as broad construction of the Constitution, that they take the idea. They're more of, well, this is the spirit of the law, right? This is the spirit of the Constitution. As long as we stay within the spirit of the law and what we were talking about when we formed the country, this should give us enough flexibility to grow as a country. Whereas Democratic Republicans were what we call strict constructionists. They have a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They say if something's not in there word for word, then it cannot be done. That there's no flexibility in the Constitution as written. That any sort of flexibility that comes from the Constitution should come from amendments. And then the final issue is, which foreign country do we believe that we should have an alliance with? The Federalists believe that we should have closer ties with the English because most Americans at this point have some sort of English background, whether it being from the British Isles or Ireland or what have you. And that was the Federalists. And then Democratic Republicans believe that we should have a closer tie to France because they were the ones who helped us in the Revolution. They were the ones that helped us overthrow England and really help us become an independent nation. So those are the main issues of the election of 1800. So let's see who actually runs this time, right? It's the exact same election that we had in 1796, literally the exact same. John Adams for president, Charles Pinckney for vice president for the Federalists, and then Thomas Jefferson as president and Aaron Burr as vice president for the Democratic Republicans. Now, this election is interesting in the fact that Alexander Hamilton gets involved in the election, very heavily involved, actually, in the election. Now, Hamilton had tried to convince the Federalists to elect Pinckney over Adams in 1796, but obviously he failed then. And he tries again here in 1800 to just not have Adams, right? So he decides, well, Pinckney will be a better option for us than Adams, even though Adams has already been president, right? So before, he had just tried to talk amongst powerful Federalists into essentially disparaging John Adams. And it's not like he was glowing about Pinckney, but he was like, he's a better option than John Adams. Well, for the election of 1796, Hamilton just spoke with very powerful Federalists. Obviously, himself being a powerful Federalist as well, seeing how he was one of the founders of the party. But again, so was John Adams, right? This time, though, in 1800, Alexander Hamilton makes the mistake of putting his hatred for John Adams into writing. And he actually sent a letter to other leading Federalists urging them to support Pinckney over Adams. And he said that Adams was a man of disgusting egotism, vanity without bounds. Right? He put this in writing. It was only supposed to circulate among those Federalists. But Aaron Burr actually got a copy of this. And as you can imagine, what fun he and the Democratic Republicans had by telling people how Hamilton and the Federalists were against somebody in their own party. Not only somebody in their own party, but the freaking President of the United States. Right? And it really hurt them. And it made the election incredibly close. Right? This is how the election turns out. As you can see, it's incredibly close in the election, but the Democratic Republicans barely win. They win by 8 votes, right? 73 to 65. So even with all of the craziness going on with the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans are the only ones that are able to squeak out a victory here, right? So the problem with this, you would think, okay, well, the Democratic Republicans won. Now Jefferson's president, and we're all good. But the Democratic Republican electors gave both Jefferson and Burr the same number of votes. The Democratic Republicans were so intent on unifying their party, they forgot how the procedure of the elections work and how the Electoral College worked at the time. They needed a majority of votes for Jefferson. What they essentially needed was 73 votes for Jefferson, 72 for Burr, and then you would have your president and your vice president, right? Well, the Constitution said what in the case of a tie? Where does it go? The decision is made in the House of Representatives. So it's based upon each state having one vote. So each state delegation would decide amongst themselves who they thought they should vote for. Well, in order to win, you had to get a majority. All right, you had to get the majority this time. Well, there are 16 states, so 9 is the majority in this case. Well, guess how many states the Federalists controlled? They controlled 8 of the states. So now it's split, 8-8. So the states are evenly divided, so they can't even decide who won, can they? So what could they do? The Federalists could keep everybody from winning. So some Federalists said, hey, that's good. We can make some trouble here. So Hamilton said, let's support Burr, and this will cause this dissension within the Democratic Republican ranks. Besides that, Jefferson will promise us things for our support, so we can essentially try to extort this election from Jefferson to get him to make some concessions to us. Right? Well, Congress met in December of 1800 and voted, and voted, and voted, and each time they could not reach a majority for Jefferson. In fact, they called the vote 34 times, with the vote being split each time. Now, the 35th vote is the one that broke the logjam. And it happens just before inauguration. So this is how long this lasts. It's not like they took all of these votes in December, right? It's lasting this long until it's almost inauguration time, right? Now, most people say that the person who broke the logjam was none other than Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton said that you always had to think of what was good for the public. And in this instance, he did. He decided, okay, we've had our fun. We've made our point, right? And Aaron Burr didn't do what they thought Aaron Burr should do, right? Aaron Burr should have said, oh, hey, I'm supposed to be the vice president. Don't vote for me. Vote for Jefferson. Give me one less vote, right? But he didn't. He never stepped aside. He was thinking that this was his chance to be president, that he could essentially steal the presidency from his own party and from Jefferson, right? So Aaron Burr never backed out. He never did anything of the sort. So Hamilton saw, what was going on. He's like, okay, well, we need to really do something about this, right? And he wrote a letter to the Federalist representatives from Delaware. And Hamilton urged the delegate to vote for Jefferson. He convinced him that Burr was way more dangerous than Jefferson could possibly even dream of being. So this delegate changed his vote on the 35th ballot, and Jefferson ends up winning. So now, what happens is that this will cause a lot of friction between Burr and Jefferson, to such an extent that Burr won't be on Jefferson's ticket 4 years later in 1804, right? So that's what happens there, right? Now, this election has significant, tremendous repercussions for 2 reasons. One, don't you think it was time for people to recognize that the party system was here to stay, and we needed the system that allowed for a separate election of the president and the vice president? Yeah. So by 1804, the Constitution was amended, and we get the 12th Amendment. It provided for a separate election for the president and the vice president, right? It's like recognizing that the party was here to stay, right? People are going to vote on a party basis, and we've already talked about this before, right? It essentially allows for the block voting of the president and the vice president, right? Now, the next thing is more important. The Federalists complained mightily that the country was just going to go to hell because the Democratic Republicans are now in charge. But they left office peacefully and let the Democratic Republicans take over. There was no revolution, there was no war, there was no violence. It was a peaceful transfer of power at the ballot box. How many times does that happen today in most parts of the world? Not very often. You have military coups, you have dictators who say that they were democratically elected but then get more votes than people in the nation, things like that, right? So that's one of the great things about America today, right? We have an election in which we say all kinds of extreme things to one another and how much the other side is shitty and how the whole country is just going to be completely fucked if the other party becomes in control, right? We say all of these horrible, horrible things, and then when it comes to it, we peacefully transfer power and, shake each other's hand and say, well, good luck, hope you do well, right? To other people it seems insane, but to us it seems normal, and we would like to see that kind of peaceful transfer of power elsewhere in the world, right? So, now, here's what happens with Jefferson once he gets into office. So Jefferson breaks that tie with Burr, and now he becomes president. So Jefferson is going to reorient the government in favor of a much more limited government, a much more efficient government. Do you think Jefferson is going to come into office and reissue the Alien and Sedition Acts and use it against the Federalists? I mean, they did do it to him, but no, he's not going to do that. The Sedition Act is going to be allowed to die. Everyone in jail due to the Sedition Act is going to be pardoned. Everyone that had been fined because of the Sedition Act is going to be repaid. So he's going to reorient the government in the direction of civil liberties. Remember, Democratic Republicans have a very strict construction of the Constitution, so he's going to try to follow this. Jefferson is also going to eliminate all taxes. That's right, all taxes. He's going to eliminate them all. The government is going to get its money from selling land and collecting tariff duties, not collecting taxes off the individual. And he's also going to cut the size of the government in ways you just can't believe. So he's going to reorient it more towards that farmer culture and the farmer mentality that he believes that America should be governed by. Now, of course, Jefferson is going to run into some struggles, especially when it comes to the Federalists. And Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, one of their main areas of struggle is with the Federalists in the federal court system. Now, when Jefferson came into the presidency, a lot of the Democratic Republicans were angry with the Federalist judges in the federal courts. Now, why do you suppose that they were angry with them? Well, it's because of the Sedition Act and the way they upheld this act. Maybe even more was how the Federalist judges sort of made political speeches from the bench, and they supported the Sedition Act. And you really don't want your judges making political speeches from the bench. You want them to be impartial observers of the law and to rule impartially, not to be politically minded when it comes to this stuff. At least that's how we would like it to be, right? So, the Federalist judges had been very enthusiastic in supporting the Sedition Act, and the Democratic Republicans just didn't like it. Another reason was the Federalists, when they realized they had lost the presidential election, had very deliberately tried to make the federal court system become a stronghold from which they could continue to fight Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Now, one great concrete example of this is that after Jefferson had won the election, but before he was able to take office, the Federalists appointed a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. So, in January of 1801, so after Jefferson has won, but before he takes office in March, the Federalists name John Marshall the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, he was from Virginia, and he was actually second cousins to Thomas Jefferson. And he hates Thomas Jefferson. So he hates his second cousin, Thomas Jefferson. He was an all-out Federalist and disagreed with just about everything the Democratic Republicans believed in, including Thomas Jefferson. Now, how would you like to be Jefferson, and 2 months before you take office, your opposition appoints your second cousin who hates you as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, right? And by the way, John Marshall's only going to live to 1835 and decide every major court case that occurs during those years along Federalist principles, right? John Marshall, at the time he dies, was the longest serving justice period in the Supreme Court, and I believe now he's the second longest, only having being beat out by a few months by another justice in the 1920s. So he serves a very long time. In fact, he even outlives the Federalist Party. That's how long he is in his position. And another interesting note is when they appoint him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he is also the Secretary of State at the time. And so he actually holds down both offices for the next few months, acting as the Secretary of State and as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So very unique accomplishment there by John Marshall. So now all of this tension and everything between Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists comes to a head with the case of Marbury versus Madison. Now, this case came out of the laws that were in effect for governing the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. Do we know who makes the rules and regulations for Washington, D.C.? Maybe, maybe not. It's Congress. Congress makes the laws and regulations for Washington, D.C. So Congress passed an act at the last minute under John Adams' administration. And part of this act provided for the appointments of the offices of Justices of the Peace, right? So it allowed for appointments of Justices of the Peace. And essentially, the president is the one who can make these appointments. Now, this is a minor judicial appointment that deals with misdemeanors within the District of Columbia. Essentially, you deal with misdemeanors, you give out subpoenas, you can marry people, things like that, right? So these were all appointed by John Adams at the last minute, which many Democratic Republicans affectionately called the midnight appointments. Now, one of the men appointed as a JP by John Adams was a man named William Marbury. Marbury was appointed to this commission, and his commission was signed by John Adams, but his commission was never delivered to him. Now, the person who was responsible for delivering this commission to William Marbury was the Secretary of State. Well, the Secretary of State at the time was John Marshall, but he's kind of busy doing other things, being the Chief Justice. So William Marbury kind of falls through the cracks here a little bit. Well, right after Adams does this, the administration changes, and Jefferson made his friend James Madison the Secretary of State. So now it falls on James Madison to deliver this appointment to William Marbury. But Madison refused to give Marbury the commission. They didn't like each other. Marbury is an all-out Federalist. James Madison, again, being a Democratic Republican. And there was some words exchanged at certain points, and they didn't like each other. So Madison just refuses. So Marbury, like every good American does, he sues James Madison, and it gets to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, he asked the Supreme Court to issue a writ to Madison to hand over the commission to Marbury. Now, the Supreme Court had this power to issue the writ under a section of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which, remember, that's what set up the federal courts. In fact, it's Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which allows the court to give these writs. So, this finally gets to John Marshall's court there in 1803. Now, of course, he wants to decide in favor of William Marbury, but he has a problem. Suppose he decided to rule in favor of Marbury, and then Jefferson and Madison simply say, no, we're not going to do it. Well, who has more power, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court or the President of the United States? If you're having a problem with that, who has an army and who doesn't? Yeah, the President has the army, the Chief Justice has no army. So, what's going to happen there, right? And just suppose that the Chief Justice makes this decision and the President decides to ignore it. Well, we don't have a precedent for that yet. What's going to happen? So, John Marshall is a bit in a bind here. But the way he gets out of it is absolutely brilliant with the decision. So when Marshall's giving the decision of the court, he makes 3 points. His first point is, should Marbury even have this commission? And the answer, of course, is an overwhelming yes. Of course he does. And then Marshall gives Jefferson and Madison a tongue lashing for not giving this commission to Marbury. If you want to go read the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court just absolutely destroy the President and the Secretary of State, you could go on the supremecourt.gov and look up this case. Every case that's ever been decided by the Supreme Court is on there, and you can still go back and read the transcript of John Marshall just blasting Madison and Jefferson. It's actually quite funny. Then his second point. So he asks, okay, does Marbury have a legal way of getting this commission? And the answer is yes, but John Marshall does not know quite what the remedy is. Right? He doesn't know what the solution is. So, if you haven't figured that out, if the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who is supposed to be the preeminent legal mind in the United States, says you have a legal way to get something, but he doesn't know how you can get it, you're probably not going to get it. And that leads to the third point. He says, the reason why I don't know how Marbury can get this is because the Supreme Court can't answer that, because the Supreme Court does not have the power to issue such an order. Because Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. All right? So now he's ruled an act of Congress unconstitutional. Essentially what he said is like, look, the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction is complete in the Constitution. The Constitution lays out exactly what the Supreme Court's jurisdiction is. Then the Judiciary Act of 1789 adds on to that jurisdiction, and it makes it unconstitutional. All right? So it's an unconstitutional add-on to our original jurisdiction. Okay? Now this is kind of interesting because Federalists are supposed to be kind of broad constructionists, but this is a very strict constructionist type of viewpoint here. So Marshall is actually using the philosophies of the Democratic Republicans against them. So what he's essentially saying is that Marbury should have this commission. He has a legal right to the commission, but he can't issue the commission, right? So he denied the court one teeny tiny power, right? One teeny tiny power to issue these writs, right? But he gives the court a much bigger power. A much bigger power. The power to determine if something is constitutional or not. And we call that power judicial review. So the ability for the Supreme Court to rule if something is constitutional or not is known as judicial review. So he denied this one little power that he couldn't have used anyway, that he couldn't have forced anyway, that Jefferson and Madison could have easily ignored. And he asserts a very huge power. The power to interpret the Constitution. This is when they finally get that power. Right? We had seen it before. They hadn't taken that power yet, right? Now, Congress had punted it to them with the Judiciary Act of 1789. The president or the states hadn't taken control of it. We saw that Jefferson and Madison had suggested that the states should take that power there with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. But it hasn't been taken yet. Now it is taken because John Marshall issues this ruling here in Marbury versus Madison. So now the Supreme Court determines what's constitutional and what's not. Not Congress, not the president, not the states, not the people. The Supreme Court is now the interpreters of the Constitution. Another issue that comes up for Jefferson here in 1803, aside from Marbury versus Madison, is the issue of Louisiana. Now, of course, I hope we all know where Louisiana is, right? And why it's so important to the United States. Because the Mississippi River flows down into the Gulf of Mexico here, and New Orleans is an incredibly important port on the Gulf of Mexico. If you control the Mississippi, you can control the United States, as we saw what Spain did earlier when they tried to keep closing the port of New Orleans to the Americans coming over and trying to turn the Americans over to the Spanish side. Well, eventually we came to an agreement with Spain to quit doing that in 1795, and we've been on good terms with the Spanish ever since. However, shortly after Jefferson had become president, word came that the Spanish had ceded Louisiana back to France, who had originally owned it. Now, Spain is becoming weaker and weaker over there in Europe, especially when we get into the 1800s, and somebody's going to come along and take advantage of that. And that person is Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon is now leader of France, and now we have Napoleonic France, and Napoleon is over in Europe, essentially just wiping out all of Europe at this point. He's conquering people left and right in Europe, and he's turned his sights on Spain. And to make a very complicated story fairly simple, Napoleon essentially says to the King of Spain, hey, you have this thing called Louisiana, and we want it back. That was our land to begin with, and we want it back. So you're going to give it back to us. Otherwise, I'm going to invade you. So the King of Spain essentially says, oh, well, if you put it that way, here you go. And so they sign over Louisiana back to France. Now, this is a very long process, and some things happen, but that's essentially what happens. If you're really interested in it, go look into it a little further. The story is a little bit more complicated, but that's essentially what happens. Well, Napoleon's going to invade Spain anyway, so it doesn't really matter. He didn't really keep his word, right? So now Napoleon is looking to create an American empire. He's going to take a break from taking out all of Europe and making war on all of Europe to create this American empire. He's going to base his American empire in the French West Indies in a colony named Haiti. Now, it's going to be based in the West Indies, but Louisiana is going to feed the entirety of the French American Empire, and hopefully the French Empire period. And of course, most of this area here is known as the breadbasket, right? Because of the great soil out here that grows a lot of crops and grows them strong and grows a lot of them. So Napoleon wants to use Louisiana to feed his empire. Now, this is an absolute threat to the security of the United States, right? It's as opposed to having a weakening Spain as a cordial neighbor that we've come to a treaty with. Now we have Napoleonic France as our neighbor. And even though Jefferson is pro-France, he's not necessarily pro-Napoleon, because he knows the proclivities of Napoleon and what he could possibly do. Because if he decides to create an American empire, he's already tried to take over kingdoms in Europe that have lasted for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So what's going to keep him from trying to decimate a country that is hardly 10, 20 years old? Right? So there's some fear there going on that Napoleon, if he gets over here, is going to try to take over America and make it part of the French Empire. So what Jefferson did is he sends a message to the U.S. minister to France at that time, a guy by the name of Livingston, and he told him to try to make a deal to buy the Isle of New Orleans and access to the Mississippi River for $5 million. So Livingston gets this, and he starts negotiations with France about, okay, we want the Isle of New Orleans. We want just access to the Mississippi River. We don't want to own the Mississippi River. Just give us access to it, and we'll give you $5 million. Now, of course, some of you are thinking the Isle of New Orleans. Yes, New Orleans is on an island, right? So they just want to buy essentially New Orleans and access to the Mississippi River. That's it. He's given $5 million to do so. Well, Jefferson begins to think maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need to figure something else out. I don't know what's going to happen here. Let's see. So he gets his good friend James Monroe. Of course, we saw James Monroe at the Battle of Trenton. Remember, he got shot through the ankle. Well, James Monroe is called upon by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they come up with a plan for Monroe to go over to France and essentially offer a better deal to the French. So what they have Monroe do is they say, okay, we're going to ship you over. You're going to talk with Livingston. You're all going to negotiate together. But we told Livingston that to just buy the Isle of New Orleans and access to the Mississippi River for $5 million. Well, we think we may be lowballing this a little bit. So Monroe, you're going to go over there and you're going to offer $10 million for the Isle of New Orleans, access to the Mississippi River, and as much of Florida as you can get. All right? And that'll hopefully, because they knew that there was tensions there between the Spanish and the French going on anyway, maybe this will help ease the tension here a little bit. So Monroe is on his way over, right? And he's on his way over, and before he leaves, Jefferson says, look, if this doesn't work, if you and Livingston can't get something done, Monroe, go to England and start making an alliance with England, who is obviously at war with Napoleon. Now, this is not a step that Thomas Jefferson wants to take. Remember, he is very pro-French. He doesn't want an alliance with the British, but he also is a pragmatist and realizes that if this doesn't go well and Napoleon comes over to America, they're in a lot of trouble. So, Monroe is on his way over to meet with Livingston. But while Livingston's negotiating and while Monroe is on his way over, this is what happens. Napoleon has something happen in Haiti while all this is going on from the American side. And Napoleon's idea for building an American empire just didn't work out. Because what happens is that there was a slave rebellion in Haiti. And he needed to put this down. And he sent over an army of 40,000 French soldiers to Haiti to put down this slave rebellion. Because he's like, well, this is going to be my capital of my American empire. I can't have this massive slave revolt. So he sends over this large army. And at the head of that army is his brother-in-law, his wife's brother. But when they get over to Haiti, you would think, okay, the French army that is clearly wiping out half of Europe at this time can easily put down a slave revolt in Haiti. And you would have thought wrong. Because when they get there, most of the army is wiped out by yellow fever and malaria, and the slaves who are revolting. And they essentially wipe out the entire army. And they also killed Napoleon's brother-in-law. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but you cannot get your wife's brother killed on an expedition. You just can't. Even a guy like Napoleon has to answer to his wife. And he begins to think, oh, God, my army can't even put down a slave rebellion over there. What is going on? Maybe I should just stick to the things I know. So he's beginning to have doubts about this American empire. And so when this happens, right before Monroe gets to Livingston, the French go to Livingston and say, okay, we've thought about your offer about the Isle of New Orleans and access to the Mississippi for $5 million. And we're going to have to reject it. Livingston's like, oh no, what am I going to do now? And the French say, we reject your offer because you have to take the entirety of Louisiana. And Livingston's like, what? Yeah, you have to take the entirety of Louisiana, not just New Orleans and the access to the Mississippi River. You have to take all of Louisiana from us. Livingston is in shock, and he's like, okay, how much for this? The French say $15 million. Livingston is, again, in shock. $15 million for the entire thing. French say yes. So Livingston says, I have to think about this. And the French say, well, you need to make it quick. Well, around this time is when Monroe gets to Livingston. Monroe comes in and tells him the plan of what Jefferson and Madison had told him, right? Hey, I have $10 million. They thought maybe we were lowballing a little bit. Livingston's like, shut up. You cannot believe what just happened. Monroe's like, what happened? What's going on? He said, they offered me the entirety of Louisiana for $15 million. And Monroe and Livingston are freaking out. They're like, oh my gosh, we cannot believe our luck here. So, but they didn't have the authority to spend $15 million. Livingston had the authority to spend $5 million. Monroe had the authority to spend $10 million, and now it's $15 million. But it's for the entirety of Louisiana. For those of you that don't know, that works out to essentially 2.4 cents an acre. 2.4 cents an acre. That's insane. That's even insane in 1803. That's an insane price for that amount of land in 1803. Obviously much less now, right? 2.4 cents an acre. It's incredible. Now, of course, Monroe and Livingston don't have the power to do this. They have no power to do this whatsoever. But they're not idiots either. They don't go back to Napoleon and say, well, we can't consider this because Jefferson didn't give us the authority to do this, right? Instead, they talk amongst themselves like, we have to take this. So they go back to Napoleon and they say, we'll take it. We'll take it. We'll deal. Done deal. And they work out a purchase agreement where the U.S. would buy Louisiana for $15 million, right? So that's all of Louisiana. That doubles the size of the country and gives us absolute control of the Mississippi River. We don't have to buy access to it. We own it now, right? Can you think of anything more important to the future of the United States as an independent republic than this? They get to control the Mississippi. They'll essentially control the Gulf Coast. And they've doubled the size of the country. It's incredible. All for 2.4 cents an acre. Right? So, they brought this purchase home, and it raised a real nice question. Because Jefferson, remember, he's a strict constructionist, right, of the Constitution. So he's supposed to read it very strictly and follow it very strictly. Well, is there anything in the Constitution that says that the president can buy land just because? No, there's not. There's nothing in there that says the president can just buy land. So, now, Jefferson, with his strict constructionist ideas, is trying to figure something out here. So some of his supporters say, well, we can make an amendment. We can make an amendment that says that the president can buy land in these types of situations, and it'll be constitutional then. But how long is that going to take? Months. Easy. Months. Because you got to send it out to the states. You got to approve it. It's got to come back. It's got to be ratified. Blah, 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 blah. Right? All that stuff. Okay? That's going to take months. Do we want Napoleonic France to be sitting on this land deal for months? No. No. Because what if he changes his mind? What if the tide turns for France and he's like, you know what? I'm feeling pretty good about that American empire now. I've kind of thought about it some, and we're going to do it. You don't want that to happen. You don't want Napoleon back in America. You need to act quickly. Well, somebody else said, well, the president can't approve treaties, and then the Senate approves the treaty. So if we do this as a treaty, then you can buy the land as part of a treaty, and then the Senate can just ratify it real quick. Well, is that strict construction or is that broad construction? It's kind of broad construction. That's not really what they meant by a treaty when they first wrote it, not just a treaty to buy land. That's kind of getting around the whole thing, isn't it? But Jefferson, again, is not an idiot, right? He realizes how important Louisiana is, and so that's what he agrees to. That's the one that he can agree to. So the purchase of Louisiana ends up being in the form of a treaty. Right? So they come up with this treaty that sorts out all the details of buying Louisiana. The Spanish are kind of involved in this, all this kind of crazy stuff, right? But we're trying to simplify it here, right? So the Americans sign it they approve it on October 20th of 1803, and eventually by December 30th, 1803, the United States officially occupies Louisiana, right? Now, some people criticized Jefferson for this. They said he was violating his constitutional principles with this purchase. And Jefferson himself was even a little concerned with it, right? But Jefferson knew that this was very important, and to turn down buying Louisiana because of some constitutional scruples would have been a fool, right? It would have been a total fool move for him to do. Jefferson may have been a lot of things, but he wasn't a fool. So people even today criticize him for that he set aside his principles for this. But he's also a pragmatist, right? He realizes that this is that important, right? So, okay. So now we have an agreement in place to buy it. Do you think the United States just had $15 million just laid around? Do you think they're going to go to Jefferson's nightstand and scrape $15 million off his nightstand? No. So what they have to do is essentially they give Napoleon IOUs, right? They say, okay, Napoleon, we owe you $15 million and we'll pay you back, essentially in installment plans, right? They essentially they get a mortgage on Louisiana with Napoleon. Well, Napoleon needs the money now, right? He needs cash now, right? So he goes and sells all those IOUs to British bankers. And the British bankers give him $15 million, which he then uses that $15 million to wage war on Britain. Yep, he uses British money to go fight the British. Money has no loyalty. The British bankers know that the Americans are going to pay it back and they're going to get interest. So they're like, yeah, Napoleon, here's $15 million. Go screw up our country's army. Who cares? Right? So now Napoleon gets back into his comfort zone and starts to rampage through Europe. And now the United States has control of Louisiana. So Jefferson's term was pretty successful. And it turns out that he made a lot of the correct moves, even though he may have had some reservations with his own personal philosophies. So we have to skip ahead a little bit here. We need to skip essentially past the War of 1812. Now, essentially what happens in a very quick nutshell here, the English decide to come over and reinvade America after a series of bad diplomatic adventures by the United States and Britain, and there's a lot of misunderstandings, and we essentially go to war again in 1812. This is when the White House is burned down, or the presidential mansion is burned down, and eventually when they rebuild it, they have nothing but white paint around, so they paint it white, and it becomes the White House, right? America tries to invade Canada yet again, and we fail yet again to invade Canada. But eventually the United States wins the War of 1812, which is also called, I believe we mentioned earlier, the Second War of American Independence, right? And so now everything's all hunky-dory. The Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812. And right after this, the country is swept up with this spirit of nationalism. Now, of course, we talked about this earlier, the nationalism here meaning that you would do anything for the country, even if it was detrimental to you. So we saw all this kind of nationalism all over the place, right? And it's going to really hit its peak here after the War of 1812, which of course ends in 1814. Now, right after the War of 1812, the United States grows immensely during this time period. The population grew from 7.5 million people to 9.5 million people from 1810 to 1820. So we have a little mini baby boom here in that decade. And I may be thinking, well, that's only a 2 million person increase. But to the population at the time, that's almost a 33% increase in the amount of people in the country, right? So think about if America today went from 350 million people to 475 million people in a matter of a decade. That'd be a huge burst of people, right? Well, with this growing population comes a grow westward, right? People start to move westward. They want a little bit more space. And they move into the old Northwest and the old Southwest. And just between 1815 and 1819, there were 4 more states that are allowed into the Union from these regions, right? And they're Illinois, Indiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. All right, so Illinois and Indiana, you can see 1816, 1818. Mississippi and Alabama, 1817, 1819. So those 4 states are added almost immediately following the War of 1812. So it's a very significant growth going on in the country, both population-wise, both adding new states. And we also start to see with this growing population, we also start to see a significant change in the economy in the United States. Now, generally speaking, from the colonial period up until beyond the Revolution, the economy of the United States was that of what we refer to as a subsistence economy, right? People farmed. That was the main job. That was the main job of people in America, was farming. And namely subsistence farming. And of course, subsistence farming means farming to live, right? Farming to live. That you're farming to feed your family, and maybe you have a little bit extra that you can sell at a market or what have you, but you're essentially farming to live. That is what most Americans do at this point. They're not cash crop farmers, they're not manufacturers, they're not fishermen. For the majority of Americans, you are a subsistence farmer. Right? So the model of this is that small farm. Well, by this time, 1815, the United States was very much involved in what we refer to as a market revolution. It was switching from a subsistence economy to a market economy. Now, in a market economy, you try to sell things, right? You don't produce just for yourself. You sit there and try to produce something that you can sell. Try to sell something. So you're producing what makes the most sense for you to sell, and you plan on buying all the things that you don't produce for yourself from the products that you have sold. Right? So you've gone from just farming for your family to farming a specific thing, whether wheat, corn, indigo, tobacco, whatever. You're going to sell that, you're going to grow and sell that, and then use the money to buy everything else you need. That's what you do in a market economy. Particularly if you're a southern farmer who will, instead of growing everything he needs, will instead plant cotton and will begin selling it to buy everything else he needs, right? So that's a good example. A market economy is much more complex than a subsistence economy, but it will also give you a much better life than a subsistence economy. Now, some people say, well, maybe it won't, maybe it will. The problem with the market economy is that, yes, you have the potential to get a better life, but what can you also end up with in a market economy? You can also end up with a much worse life, but as a whole, it makes society better. For example, what if the things you need to buy cost a whole lot more than what you're producing? Well, what determines that? The market, right? Supply and demand. Those that aren't very successful in the market economy, who are they going to blame for their failure? Well, let's think about it another way. If you're successful in the market economy, who are you going to heap praise on? Yourself, right? Yourself. I was the one who did this. I made this great product and I'm getting all this money from it. This is great. I am great. Well, if you fail in the market economy, who are you going to blame yourself? Are you going to blame yourself? No, you're not going to blame yourself. Of course, it's somebody else's fault, right? It's the market's fault. It's the customer's fault. It's the government's fault. It's everybody's fault but your own. Because clearly you're perfect and did everything right, and everybody else is wrong. So you're not going to blame yourself, because that would take self-awareness and self-introspection and self-reflection. Who has time for that? So, now a market revolution really changed this country. A lot of people liked it, some people didn't. But once it began, as they say, a cat's out of the bag. You can't put it back. Yet some people try to stop it. But once it's started, it doesn't stop. It keeps rolling until eventually the entire American economy becomes a market. But what else do you need in a market revolution? So now you've created this market, and now you're starting to create products that you're going to try to sell. Well, how are you going to sell those products? Where's the market? How do you get your things to market? Well, you get those things to market through a transportation revolution. So you can't have a market-based economy without the means by which to transport your goods. Nobody's coming out to your farm to buy your cotton or to buy your wheat. Nobody is coming around to sell you wool shirts or oatmeal or whatever. You have to go to the market. So, to get your things to the market, you have to undergo a transportation revolution, which is what this country did. Now, up until this time in the United States, the means of travel were essentially either roads or rivers. Roads were not of good quality. They were typically dirt roads. Dirt roads, when it rains, it gets muddy, they get rough. You can get stuck in them. You can break wagon wheels. You can lose your stuff. They're just not very reliable. Rivers were great as long as you're going with the current. But if you're trying to go against the current, you're going to have a bad time. So the point to remember here is that transportation was slow and it was expensive. But then two things came along that make a world of difference: canals and steamboats. Let's talk about canals first. Canals are man-made waterways where boats were towed by draft horses along towpaths. The most famous American canal is the Erie Canal. You can see the Erie Canal here. It starts here, runs all the way to here. All right? It's supposed to connect Lake Erie to the Hudson River. All right? So it starts in Buffalo and ends up here, kind of in the middle of nowhere, around to Albany, and then you can go to New York down the Hudson River. They started building the Erie Canal in 1817, and it's roughly 320 miles long from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. It was completed in 1825, and it was a spectacular feat of engineering. Because what they do to create this canal is they come up with something called river locks. What river locks do is they raise and lower the level of the water depending on which way the vessel was going. And then they raise and lower the water level on the other side of the river lock to allow essentially a stair-step pattern. You're going up the river, they would stair-step you up. If you're going down the river, it would stair-step you down. This is amazing. I mean, if you've never seen a canal work, I suggest go looking on YouTube and see how it works. It's amazing. They literally just sit there and raise and lower the river levels at will. Now, of course, living in modern times, that seemed like, oh yeah, okay, we can see we can do this. But they started doing this in 1817. They had this idea in 1817, and they were doing it successfully in 1825. That just blows my mind every time I think about it, that people in 1825 had figured out how to raise and lower water levels to this degree in such a sense that it allowed faster travel. It's mind-boggling. Well, when it opened in 1825, the Erie Canal lowered the price of transportation of everything. For example, a ton of wheat, literally a ton of wheat, 2,000 pounds of wheat going from Buffalo to New York City dropped from $100 per ton to $10 per ton. Wow, it's a 90% drop in transportation costs. 90%. Well, what do you think that does to prices? It drops them as well. Now these farmers can sell more wheat because more people can afford to buy wheat. So therefore they can transport more wheat, they can make more money because the transportation costs have gone down, which drives down the cost of the products and everything else. So now more people have access to it, more people are buying it, so now you're selling more stuff and you're not having to charge as much, but you're making a larger profit. And once people start to figure this out, other states got involved in canal building. And by the time you get to the late 1830s, there are thousands of miles of canals in this country. Now, of course, most of them are through the states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, which you can see here. This is New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio here, and that's where a lot of those canals are. All right, but this is a great map of all the canals being built once the Erie Canal opens in 1825 all the way to the beginning of the Civil War. But that is a lot of mileage of canals there. So that's one way we do it. Then, of course, another way we do it is through steamboats. Now, it's generally said that the first successful steamboat run was on the Hudson River there in New York by a man by the name of Robert Fulton in 1807. So Robert Fulton is generally seen as running the first successful steamboat. Now, of course, that may have not been the first attempt at a steamboat. We generally see that as the first successful attempt at steamboat. Now, of course, steam power had been around for a while, but it kind of got lost at some point. We have records that the Greeks probably used steam power to open heavy doors and things of that nature, but this is the first time we're really starting to see steam put forth for power purposes when it came to moving humans. Now, it wasn't entirely the eastern rivers that really needed the steamboats, but those in the west. And by the 1830s, there are over 300 steamboats operating on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers alone. So the steamboats allow you to go against the current with power. And they can speed up. You can speed up going downstream. You can use the current with you and use that power to push you further downstream quicker. Or it allows you to power upstream and get to your locations a lot faster. Now, what do Americans do with anything that moves? Get your mind out of the gutter. We race them, right? Anything that moves in this country, we race it. If you've ever been to a county fair or a state fair, we race everything, right? We race bullfrogs, we race roaches, we race dogs, we race horses, we race cars, we race boats, we race humans. So do you think they raced steamboats? Of course they did. Of course they raced steamboats. Now, steamboat racing was sort of dangerous because what they would do is to make the steamboats go faster, instead of throwing in coal or wood to power the steam engine, they would instead throw in pure turpentine. And pure turpentine has a lot faster boiling point, or a lot lower boiling point, and it flashes up quicker and turns into steam a lot quicker. But the problem is, if you put too much pure turpentine into the steam engine, it blows up. And you can blow up the steamboat and everybody around it. But hey, everybody was having fun, right? So hey, let's just keep doing it. Right? So steamboats had a lot of say in how America got around in transporting things to and from market. Now, of course, I hope there's an obvious one that is being left out here that hopefully you can figure out. What's the third one? Railroads, right? Railroads. Leaving out railroads here. I don't have it on the outline. We're not really going to talk about it because every other historian talks about it to death. For whatever reason, historians are giant railroad nerds, and more power to them. They really like the railroads, but try being around academics for your entire life and listening about railroads all the time, and you really don't want to talk about it. Plus, if you have me for US 2, we'll talk plenty about railroads then. But those are our three main things: canals, steamboats, and of course, railroads are going to revolutionize, there we go, revolutionize the transportation industry. Now, we have this marketing or market revolution, we have our transportation revolution, and then we get the beginnings of the industrial revolution. So we also start to see a rise in manufacturing in the United States. No longer would the United States import all of their cloth, clothes, shoes, furniture, etc. It would begin to manufacture some of these items for themselves. Now, the United States didn't become an industrial giant during this period. That would not occur until after the Civil War. But the beginning of it is here. Now, of course, hopefully all of you have heard about Eli Whitney during this period and probably know what he was invented, or what he invented, right? And what he's famous for inventing. That's right, the cotton gin. Cotton gin. Right? It was supposed to make picking cotton a lot easier, and the purpose of it was to actually ease slavery and try to get rid of slavery by giving southern cotton planters a better way to separate cotton from the seeds and get more cotton for less work. But it had the opposite effect. It essentially allowed large plantation owners to go and buy up more land and buy up small plantations and get more slaves so they can get more cotton. Whoops. But at least his heart was in the right place, right? But the more important invention in relation to manufacturing with Eli Whitney is something called interchangeable parts. There's still argument about whether or not Eli Whitney invented interchangeable parts or if he was just a great promoter of interchangeable parts. But either way, he is synonymously tied with interchangeable parts. Now, where he really advocated for interchangeable parts was in gun manufacture. Because if a gun breaks, those parts are unique to that gun, and you would have to go buy a new gun as opposed to just replacing, say, a trigger or a stock or what have you that went faulty when the rest of the gun was good. You'd just have to go get a whole new one because those things were unique to that gun. He said, saying, well, if the trigger goes bad but the rest of the gun's good, why don't we just replace the trigger? Or, if the hammer is bad, why don't we just replace the hammer? Well, eventually he starts to put that together towards manufacturing. Now, this is important for the Industrial Revolution in that it really simplifies the economies there of the industrial era, right? So let's take this as an example, right? So say this gear here, right, goes out, but it's the exact same as this gear back here. It's the exact same machine. Well, before interchangeable parts, this gear was solely for this machine. And it may be a little different than this gear here, which on the exact same machine that does the exact same thing. So if this machine breaks, you have to go to the manufacturer and get an entirely new gear created, and maybe the mold for that gear no longer exists or it was broken, so now your machine is out for weeks, months, or maybe forever. Right? Production has to stop. But with interchangeable parts, you could buy for these machines here, say you have just these 2 or 3 here, right? And one breaks. Well, what you would do is you would have an extra gear or 2, just in case this breaks. You would have an extra gear over in the back or what have you. And you could bring it out and you would lose minutes, maybe hours replacing the gear as opposed to days, weeks, or forever, right? So it makes production a lot more efficient in the country whenever you have these interchangeable parts that you can switch in and out quickly. And once they figure this out, and once they really start putting the market revolution, the transportation revolution, and the beginnings of the industrial revolution together, you really start to get an industrialized modern society out of this, that all of these things start working together. And it's really going to affect this country in many ways beyond economics, mainly into politics and especially into the international realm of politics as well. So this all is starting to work together to form a unique American identity here. So now we are deeply entrenched into this era of good feelings and this feelings of nationalism. And these start to come out in our foreign policy as well, not just domestically with our economics and our population growth, but also in our foreign relations. And the key example of this is the Monroe Doctrine here in 1823. So here's a little bit of background here on the Monroe Doctrine. By the 1820s, all of Spain's American colonies are trying to get their independence, everywhere from Chile to Argentina to Mexico, right? They're all getting their independence. Do you think the United States likes this? Did we want them to be independent or remain part of Spain? Well, we liked it, and we liked it a lot. We liked to see Spanish America becoming independent. We did not want to see Spanish America go back under the influence of Spain. So we had concern back there in the 1820s. Because we wanted them to be independent for two reasons. One, independence is great, right? We're America. We love independence. Get your independence, colonies. Overthrow those colonial masters. Be independent like us. We like independence. But the second reason should also be fairly obvious. Economics, right? Remember mercantilism. Through mercantilism, if we wanted cool stuff from Mexico or Argentina, we'd have to go through Spain first. But if these countries are independent, we can cut out Spain and go directly to the source. So we really want them to be independent because of independence is great, but because the economies are great too. Now, we're happy that they're getting this, but we also know that the great powers in Europe might help Spain try to get these colonies back. And the reason why we're worried about that is because all of these European royal families are now all intermarried with one another pretty deeply. They're all essentially related. And so we're afraid that, well, if all of these colonies start getting independence, that it may lead to a collapse of the empire systems there in Europe, and they don't want that to happen, so they're going to try to help their fellow empires to keep everything up. Now, did we have the ability to tell all these European colonial powers that, hey, you should leave these places alone and let them be independent? Of course not. Of course not. We don't have that power. So it's a potential problem here. But we catch a break. Remember when we say that God watches out for fools, drunks in the United States? Well, we catch a break here again. The British government indicated to the American Secretary of State at the time, who was John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. The British government indicates to him during a meeting that they don't want to see Spain regain their colonial possessions either. The reason why is because Britain has the most advanced commercial economy in the world, and they saw a market to be exploited. So the British indicated to John Quincy Adams that they didn't want to see Spain regain her American colonies, and in fact, we're willing to make a deal so that we will stay together longer, and we don't want to see this occur. Right? So we can work together on this. So John Quincy Adams begins to mull this over. I mean, he's got an offer here that the British and the Americans can stay together and work together on this to exploit the situation at Spain's expense. Now, who has the real power here to enforce any such declaration that Spain's colonies should remain free? The U.S. or Britain? Britain, right? They had the Navy, they had the power, they had the economics. We don't. So if we come out and make a joint statement with them, how's that going to look like for us? It's going to look like we're just running along behind the greater power that are essentially tagging along to our brother's coattails here. So Adams decides to state an independent viewpoint from the American point of view based upon what the British had indicated to him without letting anyone know about this collusion between the British and the Americans. Because it's just a meeting between the two. It's not a public meeting. This is a private meeting. So nobody else knows that the British and the Americans are talking about this. So John Quincy Adams takes this back to President James Monroe. He's president at this time in 1823. And Monroe and Quincy Adams come up with this idea of the Monroe Doctrine, and that Monroe was going to announce it in his presidential address to Congress, the annual speech. Of course, now we call that the State of the Union. Right? And he's going to announce this policy towards the Western Hemisphere that eventually becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine. So this is what he says in his speech here. This is the policy he lays out, and it has two major prongs to it. The first, the Western Hemisphere, so North and South America, was closed to colonization by anyone else. So nobody outside of the Western Hemisphere can colonize anywhere within the Western Hemisphere. So an idea of non-colonization. Non-colonization from Eastern Hemisphere powers, namely Europe. 2, it closed anybody off to interfering in the Western Hemisphere if they were outside of the Western Hemisphere. So something called non-intervention. Nobody from the Eastern Hemisphere could intervene in relationships going on in the Western Hemisphere. So we have two major prongs there: non-colonization, non-intervention from outside forces into the Western Hemisphere. Now, one more time. Did the U.S. have the power to tell everyone else in the world, including Great Britain, these two stipulations? Of course not. No. We don't have that type of power back then. But we got away with it because we knew what the British policy was going to be. The British kind of think, okay, all right, they got us. They got us on that one. Okay. But the British go along with it, and the British come out and say, we respect these two stipulations, and everybody else follows suit. And now the Monroe Doctrine becomes a fundamental American foreign policy. It's right up there with neutrality and isolation that Washington set forth. Now, we don't have the power to back this up until after the Civil War, and eventually we're going to kind of use it as the basis to controlling the entire Western Hemisphere ourselves, because that's what happened. We set ourselves up to be the power in the Western Hemisphere. Didn't say anything about Western Hemisphere countries interfering in Western Hemisphere politics. It just said everybody outside of it can't interfere. But we can, and we do. So, all of these things are going on. It looks great. Everything is in order. Everybody's happy. We have this great nationalism going on. We're all unified. The era of good feelings. But some cracks begin to form. And one of the first things that leads to the breakup of this era of good feelings that starts to reveal some cracks in this foundation that will eventually lead to massive amounts of sectionalism running through this country is the Missouri Compromise. So let's talk a little bit about Missouri here and what leads to this compromise when it comes to Missouri coming into the Union. Now, at the time of the American Revolution, every colony had slavery. Every single one had slavery. But by the end of the Revolution and the beginning of the early national period, what are some of these states doing? They're getting rid of slavery. Now, is it all the colonies are doing this? No. Only the northern colonies are doing this. Only the northern states are doing this. And they're doing it for economic reasons. It's just not economically viable anymore in the north. The southern states keep it because it's economically viable for them. Now, just because the north gets rid of it doesn't mean that they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're not saying, oh, well, these people are being oppressed and we need to free them. That's not the case. It's just not economically viable. That's why they decide to get rid of it. Okay? And don't think that northerners are any less racist than southerners. In fact, in many cases, northerners are more racist because they're not around black populations like southerners are. It's a very interesting dynamic, but the northerners are like, no, those people should be free, but we don't want them here. Don't send them up here. You keep them down there. We don't want them up here, but they should be free. If you Don't believe me? Go to a place like Boston. Boston is an incredibly racist city. Southerners are shocked when they go to Boston to hear just the passive racism that goes on in that city. So, nobody that got rid of slavery is doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. That's just a hard fact. It's just a hard fact. They're not doing it. They're all just as racist. They all don't want to see this happen for good reasons, for saying, well, we're doing this out of the goodness of our heart. It's all for economic reasons. Well, as the country grew, by 1819, we have 22 states. We have 11 states that do not have slavery anymore, and we have 11 states that do have slavery. Well, why is that significant in terms of political power in Congress? What's the significance there? Okay, well, let me rephrase. What part of the country is already pulling ahead when it comes to population? The North or the South? The North, right? The North is pulling ahead, which means that they have more representatives in the House of Representatives, because that's based off population. But in the Senate, how is representation determined? One state, two votes. So in the Senate, the North and the South are balanced. There's an equality there between the two, where we have 22 votes for, 22 votes against. Now this really matters, particularly if you're a Southerner. This balance really matters because you're a little bit worried about what the North is going to do in reference to your Southern interests. Because the North has power over things like the protective tariff, over slavery, over agricultural reforms, things like that. Things that directly affect the South, the North can come in and then dictate what should happen to the South because they'll gain the political advantage. So the South is concerned with political power when it comes to the Senate and the House. Then comes along 1819 in Missouri. Missouri applied for admission to the Union as a slave state. Missouri was known for its hemp production that they used to produce ropes for industries, clothing, sacks, those type of things is what hemp was used for. Well, when Missouri applied for admission as a slave state, a congressman from New York State, which was a free state, proposed that Missouri be let in on two conditions. First of these conditions was that no more slaves could come into Missouri after it had joined the Union. So no more new slaves can be taken to Missouri after Missouri becomes officially part of the Union. The second said that any slave born in Missouri after Missouri is officially in the Union would be set free when they were 25 years old. So what is this eventually going to do to slavery in Missouri? That's right. It's going to eventually eliminate it. Gradually, but it'll eliminate it. This proposal touched off a bitter argument between the North and the South. And this argument comes from three aspects. Three different versions of this argument are brought up as to why the North and South are in disagreement here. The first aspect is political power. If this measure passes, which section of the country will eventually have more power? The North. And the South doesn't like that. That'll upset that balance of power. 2, part of it's constitutional. Could Congress really do this? I thought this, when states came into the Union, they were all equal to other states. Could all the other states have slavery? Sure. 11 just chose not to have it anymore. But could they reinstate slavery? Absolutely. Did they have any of these conditions placed on them? Absolutely not. So Missouri's actually asking the question, well, why do we have to have these conditions put on us if no other state has these conditions? That's not constitutional. So a constitutional question arose over whether or not Congress could do this to Missouri and restrict slavery in that fashion. Then 3, it made slavery into a moral issue. It brings the moral issue of slavery to the forefront in American politics at this time. Now, of course, that they had wrestled with the moral issue of slavery before, right? And we talked about that when it came to the Northwest Ordinance, and they restricted slavery in the Northwest, in that old Northwest. And it came at the suggestion of slave-owning Thomas Jefferson. So they were wrestling with this idea of the morality of slavery before, but it was more in a passive way. Now it is brought to the forefront. And the questions are, well, what's wrong with slavery? Why not have slavery? Why should we worry about whether slavery spreads or not? Slavery has been around since the beginning of civilization, since the beginning of man almost. People have enslaved one another for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And everybody has owned slaves, and everybody has been a slave. Throughout history. Doesn't matter if you're Asian, if you're African, if you're European, if you're Middle Eastern, whatever. You have been a slave, and you have owned slaves. That's just history. That is hard, factual history. It's harsh, I know, but that's just the way it is. That's how humanity has been for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Even when the Americans got into the African slave market in the 1660s, they were trying to replace Indian slavery, right? With the Spanish. The Spanish were trying to replace Indian slavery because apparently it wasn't working for them because of Bartolome de las Casas and all this kind of stuff. So they tried to tap into the African slave trade, which had been profitable for the Africans for over 2,000 years at that point. So it's been around forever. So why here in the 1800s are we all of a sudden deciding to make this a moral issue? Why, after millennia of slave-owning humanity and slave-owning and civilization, why are we just now deciding, maybe we shouldn't do this? And people begin to think, well, slavery is just wrong. It's a simple matter of ownership. You're owning a person and keeping them from being free and keeping them from making their own decisions and their own path in life. When children and husbands and wives and family members can be sold away from one another, that's humanity at its worst. So people really begin to think about this. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this so much is to ask you these questions. Can you compromise a political issue? Can you compromise a political issue? Sure, absolutely, of course, 100%. In fact, we should probably have more compromise in this country. People need to understand that we're all in this together, that Americans are in this together, that we all have valid points of view on certain issues, and that we should all come together and talk about these things in compromise. But we have so many people now that don't want to compromise, that it's either black or white, and that's causing some problems. So maybe we should compromise more politically. Okay, well, can you compromise a constitutional issue? Of course, that's what amendments are for, right? So you can compromise a constitutional issue, come together and decide, okay, well, we need to talk about this and we need to decide this. There you go. There's your amendment. But can you compromise a moral issue? Can you compromise a moral issue? If you really, truly believe something, can you compromise it? No, you really can't. Because if you compromise a moral issue, what does that make you? It makes you immoral. And nobody wants to be called immoral. Nobody wants to go through life being called immoral for the way you live. Now, of course, you'll have people like, I don't deal with modern society's morals and blah, 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 whatever. Right? They still like to think that they're moral. Because if you're not moral, that's implicitly that you're saying that you're evil. That you have no moral code. That you don't care about society at all. That you don't care about humanity. That you really don't even care about yourself. Right? And no matter what people say in public, people don't want to be called immoral. They don't want to be seen as living an immoral life. And what is the North essentially saying here when this congressman from New York says, well, this is what it is because slavery is wrong morally? He's saying that Southerners are immoral because of this. That's a big step to take. Well, now you're calling them immoral. And the Southerners don't like it because they don't want to be called immoral. They don't want to be seen as living immoral lives. So, you can't compromise moral questions. But in this case, they were able to come to a compromise here in 1820. But not obviously to the satisfaction of those who thought it was a moral issue, but a compromise was reached. The leader who worked out this compromise was a man by the name of Henry Clay, who you see there. Henry Clay is a congressman from Kentucky at this point, And he is a true nationalist. He truly believes in America. He is all for this era of good feelings, and he doesn't want to see it to end. In fact, some people say that Henry Clay is the best politician in America to never become president. Others say he's the best politician in American history, period. He held numerous positions throughout his political career. He's considered one of the most influential Americans in history. So we're going to see a lot more of Henry Clay as we move forward. But this is the compromise that Henry Clay came up with here in 1820. So what he says is that Maine will come in as a free state. Maine will be broken off from Massachusetts and become a free state, as you see here. Right? Remember, I told you a long time ago, think of Massachusetts as Massachusetts and Maine until I tell you don't think of it anymore. Now don't think of it anymore. That's that time. So Maine is now its own free state. Then Missouri will come in as a slave state. So, obvious compromise. Obvious. Now we still keep that balance. As opposed to 11-11, now it is 12-12. And what it does is it essentially puts off the moral question of slavery to another day. So we can get this done. Now, if you're one of those that believes that slavery is absolutely 100% a moral issue, and it cannot be compromised, this compromise drives you insane. Drives you insane. Because what has happened? Slavery has spread to a new territory. You see this as a loss because slavery is spread. It doesn't matter that there's another free area. Big deal. Slavery has spread. And Henry Clay understands this. He understands that there's a lot of people that believe that slavery is a moral issue. So he tries to appease these people to some degree, knowing that he couldn't completely. But what he does is he institutes something in this Missouri Compromise called the 3630 line. And this is the 3630 line here. And what it does, it applies to the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. So all of this area here, that's not Missouri, right? All this area here is what it applies to. So the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. And what it says is that all territory above the 3630 line in the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory will not have slavery. No slavery. And anywhere below it, anywhere south of it, can have slavery. And the South agrees to this, no problem. Now you may be thinking, why would the South agree to that? That's so much more land compared to this. Why? Why would they agree to this? Let me ask you, what's out here? What's out here? Like right here, what's here? Where's the laser pointed? You don't know, do you? Yeah, neither do I. Why? Because there's nothing there. There's nothing. There's nothing there. There's nothing here. Right? This is why this is considered flyover territory. This is a breadbasket, right? But there's nothing here. At least that's what most Americans think. Obviously, the people in Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas would say otherwise. But there's nothing here. And especially at this point, there's definitely nothing here. So the Southerners are perfectly fine with this. They essentially think they're giving up a bunch of prairie and a bunch of pissed off Indians. And that's about it. So, South agrees to this. Totally agrees to it. No problem whatsoever. So, now what we have happen is, even though we have a compromise here, things are going to get a lot worse. America is going to start to fracture a lot more along sectional lines. In the coming years, in the coming decades, we're going to see that this sectionalism is going to be to a point where they can't come to a compromise anymore.